you, Maureen. I really want to thank the conference organizers. As I will soon reveal, I'm someone who's primarily a text person, and I feel like I've learned so much already in this conference. It's a pleasure to be here. These are exciting times for digital visualizations of text from classical antiquity and beyond, and I only gesture to these, some of them like Hestia, Tom already mentioned yesterday. This project, MAT, has the goal of creating a queryable geospatial interface capable of visualizing multiple complete travel narratives simultaneously. And I want to start by acknowledging the team at Kenyon College, without which this would not have come to any sort of in-progress completion where we are now. My aim today is to introduce the interface. I'll also discuss the motivation behind the project and some applications for research and teaching. Lastly, and this is where the handout will come in, as an example of a research application, I'll look at how a sample data set that visualizes all travel narratives that mention the port of Cassiope on Corfu can be used to perhaps inform the interpretation of Propertius 117. The origins of the project lie in my broader interest in the rhetoric and representation of travel and geography in classical literature. It began with the question, what would it be like to read Horace Satires 1:5 mapped onto the route that the poem describes? My intention was to bring together text with map in a manner that was distinct from traditional visualizations. For example, in Emily Gower's recent Cambridge Green and Gold commentary on Satires Book 1, a map of part of the journey appears, but in an entirely different section of the book from the text and her commentary. I set out to create a digital visualization that allowed the entire text to be read on a map, rather than extracting geographical references. Here's an early visualization of Satires 1:5 with the route charted in KML and laid over the digital atlas of the Roman Empire tile. The advantages and challenges of this endeavor soon became apparent. Reading each stage of the journey, described in Satires 1:5, on a map augments the geographical dimension. I've had success in a Latin course assigning students to read the poem and then to reread it as a visualization in class. This process allows them to see the geographical relationships between towns along the Italian peninsula, relationships that would presumably have been familiar to many of Horace's contemporary readers. In addition, the map text emphasizes the way in which Horace described certain segments of the journey expansively while compressing other sections. For instance, the text tarries for 14 lines on the delayed 16-mile journey from Forum Appii to Feronia, while hurrying through the description of the final legs of the journey from Canusium to Brundusium, covering over 100 miles in 10 lines. Yet, as Emily Gower notes, skeptical readers have often interpreted the poem as part of the tradition of travel writing more than as a document of actual travel. So what then is mapped in the visualization of Satires 1:5? Horace's decision to locate the travel in the poem in Italy along routes that may have been familiar to many in his original audience engages not just the literary tradition of travel writing, but also Roman conceptions of geography. Even if Horace's ancient readers would not have conceived of geographical space in the same manner that's represented on a digital map, the visualization brings together geospatial and textual information in a way that encourages new perspectives on aspects of Roman literary geography. This is the explicit aim of the project, to visualize textual representations of travel rather than actual travel. After Horace's poem, the next question was, what would be revealed by visualizing several travel narratives at once? The objective became mapping multiple complete travel narratives in a manner that also allowed queries and filters such as mode of travel, literary genre, and language. The aim was to reveal new aspects of travel narratives by considering those narratives in relation to other travel texts that mention the same places, revealing geospatial intertextualities. In order to move from visualizing a single text to multiple texts, first I had to find a team, but then we adopted a variety of new approaches. First, we developed a different method of data creation. We selected a single point, Cassiope, as I mentioned earlier, and set out to create a visualization of every travel narrative that mentions it. We chose Cassiopeia in part because it's a relatively minor port, which limits the size of this sample data set, and in part because I was already interested in travel narratives that mentioned the port. Word searches were done to find every occurrence of Cassiopeia in Greek and Latin. The textual references that the word searches yielded were examined to determine whether they in fact referred to the port in question and whether they met the project's criteria for a travel narrative, which we defined as a textual passage that describes or implies a journey between at least two discrete points. We only consider travel in the prototype between communities rather than intra-community movement. In addition, a travel narrative may be an entire text, a section of a text, or may stretch over several shorter texts. In the case of Cassiopeia, we found 8 travel narratives that mentioned the port. These narratives describe travel through places as far west as Rome and as far east as Corinth. In the case of Cicero and Galen, the travel narratives we visualized were in fact one section of larger journeys between Rome and Asia Minor. Next, we created CSV files in which each place and segment of the journey mentioned in the narrative was represented in a row in the spreadsheet. For reasons I'll discuss in a moment, we then had to divide the data into 4 separate files. Both places and journey segments were annotated with additional relevant information for display and filtering, including geographical coordinates, a Pleiades URI, Tom might appreciate, a quotation of the passage from the narrative, genre, mode of travel, the date of composition, and the date of journey to the extent that either are knowable. The process of creating a data set based on all the travel narratives that mentioned Cassiopeia brought additional challenges. Authors employ a variety of methods to narrate travel. Satires 1.5 functions well for visualization because Horace tends to describe a journey segment, then a place, then the subsequent section of the journey in clear, discrete sections. While some travel narratives we use for the Cassiopeia dataset had similar characteristics, in other texts, certain aspects of the journey are only implied, or both a journey segment and a place would be indicated in the same phrase, necessitating repetition of part of the text. The interface that we developed to visualize the data is based on CartoDB. And Carto has a variety of useful tools out of the box and a fairly easy learning curve for simple visualizations. This past week, with the help of one of the student researchers on the project, I introduced a group of students to Carto, and most of them were able to visualize a data set within a few minutes, and the others were still in fairly good spirits. In addition, Carto has a number of built-in map layer wizards that add to the visualization, and down here you have different ways of essentially representing frequency, and that's all very easily accessible. For example, this visualization uses the cluster wizard to show the frequency that each point appears in our data set. And naturally, in this data set, Cassiopeia appears most often. You see it down here, 15 references. Further, as is to be expected, since Cassiopeia is on the route between Italy and the Eastern Mediterranean, the second most frequently mentioned place is Brindisi. The third most commonly mentioned place, Rome, is perhaps less expected, given that it's not particularly proximate to Cassiopeia. In a sense, the data seems to be reinforcing the idea that all roads lead to Rome. For all its utility, Carto nonetheless requires various customizations to create an interface that meets the goals of our project. Carto cannot visualize points and lines within the same layer. The data for points and journey segments were divided into separate spreadsheets so that they could be imported as different layers. Back to this slide. Although Carto makes it easy to create info windows so that each point and journey segment can be annotated, in our case with the relevant passage and intended information, it's not set up to allow the end user to access multiple info windows and instances when there's more than one point in the same place. So what this means was that when we initially uploaded our data at places like Cassiopeia, only the info window for one narrative was accessible for the end user, even though all the narratives by definition mentioned it. To solve this, our student researcher used SQL statements to scatter the points so that they no longer overlap but continue to be in the general vicinity of the location to which they refer. In order to link these scattered points to their corresponding journey segments, further SQL statements were employed, and 2 more spreadsheets were created to organize all journey segments by start and end point. In our current system, we have hover windows indicating place and textual citation. The passage and further information is accessible by clicking on the point or journey segment. Although initially we tried creating journey segments that traced Roman roads and possible sea lanes, we concluded that this was not feasible because it would increase the complexity of the visualization, and also because it often involved making unverifiable assumptions about the route a journey took when the narrative itself did not supply that information. As such, our segments do not adhere to roads and sea lanes, but simply are links between 2 points. In addition, land routes may be represented as passing over water, and sea routes over land, as in this journey on the right, representing a sea voyage from Corcyra to Taurus. CartoDB allows back-end querying and sorting of the data in a variety of ways. To bring filtering capability to the end user, we used a JavaScript library, cartodb.js, to create a drop-down menu with various filters. In the future, we hope to add dynamic filtering, which would allow queries from more than one category at once. In addition, we want to add timelines and allow filtering by the date of the narrative's composition and journey. Also, we hope to soon have a way of indicating directionality in the journey segments. Finally, we're in the process of making our interface and accompanying documentation available on a website. We're also already in the process of creating additional data representing travel narratives in Asia Minor and the main port on the island of Corcyra, the latter of which will offer more context for our existing Cassiopeia data. Furthermore, students in my Ancient Travel and Geography course this semester are creating data that chart the movement of Cicero via his letters. Even with our small Cassiopeia data set, some applications of MAT are apparent. This is the entire visualization. And quickly some of the filtering by language, the Greek, the Latin, land, travel, and by author. This visualization confirms Cassiopeia's role in the travel networks linking Italy and Greece. All of the narratives, whether in Latin or Greek, were written in a Roman context between 50 BCE and the 6th century CE, which may explain the frequent references to Rome. If we set aside the 2 latest sources, the Itinerarium Maritimum and Justinian, some other patterns emerge. In 3 of the remaining 6 narratives, Cicero, Gellius, and Epictetus, bad weather is involved in the journey that includes a stop at Cassiopeia. In 2 others, Suetonius and Galen, the travel to Cassiopeia is linked with some sort of hurrying. Galen is rushing to get out of Italy. Nero, in the thrall of Philhellenism, is rushing to tour the Greek world, and Cassiopeia seems to provide the earliest opportunity to do that. With this context in mind, I want to turn briefly to another possible reference to Cassiopeia not included among the visualized narratives, but perhaps informed by them. Propertius 117. In handout 1, Propertius' poet-lover undertakes a sea voyage after a fight with his beloved Cynthia. The journey goes poorly. He's left stranded on a deserted shore in the midst of a storm. In line 3, he laments that his ship will not be seen by Cassiopeia. Scholars have long been divided on how to interpret Propertius' mention of Cassiopeia. Some see it as a reference to the port on Corcyra, while others interpret it as invoking the constellation named after Queen Cassiopeia, who offended the Nereids by boasting that she was more beautiful than they. At the close of 117, Propertius prays to the Nereids for safe passage, thereby framing the poem with the myth. But the question is Propertius only referring to the constellation or imbuing the port with mythical valence? Also contributing to the problem interpreting this poem is that 117.3 is a difficult verse that has been subject to many emendations. As seen in passage 1, Paolo Fedeli prints the verse Nec mihi Cassiopeia solito visura carinam. he accepts the argument that solito implies ex solito, rendering the verse to mean, "Nor is the port of Cassiope going to see my ship, as is customary." Other critics, however, do not believe that solito can stand. The verse has been subject to emendation from Lachman on, as you can see from the apcrit in passage 2. The constellation interpretation of 117.3 recently received support from Stephen Hayward, who, as seen in passage 3, amends solito visura to solvit conversa. Hayward offers his own translation of the amended line as, "Nor has the rotation of the constellation Cassiope cast my vessel off." Hayward's primary objection to Cassiope as a place name is that he contends it is an obscure port. Yet the ancient travel narratives visualized in MAT and archaeological evidence support Fedeli's reading. The picture that emerges from the other travel narratives that we looked at is not of Cassiopei's obscurity, but rather that it's a stop for ships sailing across the Adriatic to and from Italy, perhaps particularly when the weather is unfavorable or when a short voyage is for some other reason desirable. Archaeological evidence also indicates that Cassiope was part of the trade and travel networks linking Italy and Greece, as Despini Zeriotti summarizes in her report on excavations at Cassiope. The site was an organized, fairly prosperous city that had an extensive cemetery, a well-known temple to Jupiter Cassius, and most significantly, an important port that yielded evidence of trade and contact across the Adriatic. What does this tell us about Propertius 117? Verse 3 implies a scenario in which Propertius has undertaken a sea voyage towards the eastern Mediterranean. His ship departs from Italy, only to run into bad weather while traversing the Adriatic. It seeks the first safe harbor, Cassiope. Yet the storm prevents Propertius' ship from reaching even that safe haven. Instead, it lands on the deserted shore that provides the setting for 117. Given the perspective that other travel narratives and archaeological evidence provide about travel in this area, I propose the following extended translation of 117.3 based on the version of the line printed by Fedeli. "Nor is the port of Cassiope on Corcyra going to see my ship, as is customary when one crosses the Adriatic, especially if something goes wrong." Admittedly, this translation reads a great deal into the difficult and possibly corrupt solito. I venture to demonstrate, however, that 117 combines sea travel, a storm, and Cassiope in a manner that evokes this situation in the context of ancient travel in the Adriatic. Moreover, the MAT interface elucidates some literary geographies in relation to which Propertius' reference to Cassiope may be read. That said, the intertextual nature of Propertius' mention of Cassiope in the third verse of 117 may not be limited to Cassiope, but to the island of Corcyra more generally. After all, Tibullus, in the third verse of Elegy 1.3, handout 4, also refers to the island of Corcyra in the context of a voyage gone wrong. In this case, Tibullus has gotten sick. He uses the name Phaeacia, which, like Cassiope, is rich with literary and mythological valences. The relationship between Propertius' Cassiope and Tibullus' Phaeacia, as well as Cassiopei's relationship to Corcyra more broadly within the Roman literary imaginary, are two of the topics that I intend to explore further through the aid of MAT. Thank you.